Hi guys, welcome back to my channel. So I have been reading Conflict Resolution for Holy Beings, a poetry collection by Joy Harjo, who is our current Poet Laureate. So she became our Poet Laureate in 2019. She is our first Native American Poet Laureate. So the timeline of the publication of this collection, she had just written a memoir before this, so it had been a little while since she had come out with a poetry collection. And this, I think, was a really ambitious project to jump back in with, but it made for some really beautiful, interesting poetry with a lot of depth to it. So let's dive in. So the subject matter of this collection is largely the Native American experience and sort of the tragedy and the conflicts, and also the beauty and the joys of that. And it takes a really wide lens on that experience. It's considering, you know, a really long history and considering tribes from all over the country. And so she does a lot of time traveling and sort of imagining herself in the positions of Native American people in the past. And there are certain poems that are happening in Hawaii and poems that are happening in Alaska that kind of imagine different experiences that are not necessarily her own, but there's some sort of communal connection there. So this big historic picture is a pretty ambitious subject matter. It's really all-encompassing. But then that is balanced by a lot of really focused moments. So we see things about love and community, and we see poems that explore landscape, and we see environmental writing. So there's these little very personal moments that contribute to this more global kind of perspective. And so she manages to write about tragedy in a way that is both personal and global. And it's really devastating in the way she writes it, but she also writes with a lot of hope. So every poem in this collection has a shorter, maybe sometimes a little quippy epigraph to it. So some of the epigraphs come from other writers, and some of the epigraphs come from previous work of Joy Harjo. So I think this does something really interesting to the writing, in that it feels very communal and cyclical and conversational in a lot of ways, because all of her poetry is speaking to the words of others or the words of her past self, which is a really cool effect and gives the epigraphs a lot of importance in this work. And I think that connects to the parts of this collection that are about writing poetry itself. So I think poetry and language is in itself very communal as it's represented in this piece. And you can tell that within a lot of tragedy, poetry and music and the arts in general can have a really positive effect. And I think you can tell Joy Harjo really believes in the effects that poetry can have. So Joy Harjo is also a musician, and music plays a big role in this collection. So she writes about jazz and blues within the poetry, but then the poetry itself is also very musical. So I think some of it even came directly from music, but even when it doesn't, the poetry itself is very rhythmic. She uses sort of repetitions and things like that that give it a very musical quality. So as far as the forms and the structures in this collection, there's a lot of variety, which I think is an interesting choice to sort of see what forms go with what subject matter. So there are some that have very short lines like this, and then she also writes often in these really long lines that are almost prose-like. So when we have these really long lines, there's this flow to it, and it feels like storytelling, which a lot of the poetry in here has a sort of narrative element to it. So that's in like the global sense of this really like ancient, long narrative of Native American people, and then sort of little stories along the way. I tend to like more narrative poetry in general because I think the storyline gives you a little bit more to hold on to. It feels like the end of the spectrum where poetry is really trying the hardest to be clear and not opaque, which I think for people who are new to poetry, more narrative poems are a better way in, especially if they're more used to reading fiction. So I can definitely see people who maybe aren't so familiar with poetry still really enjoying this. So in thinking a little bit about form, I want to look at the title poem, Conflict Resolution for Holy Beings, which is a longer poem and has some interesting elements. So it has these sections that are like the first ones, set conflict resolution, ground rules. So it's kind of these instructions, and then Joy Harjo breaks it down within, and this is one of the really global poems talking about Native American history in a really big way. So you can see she uses italics and underlining and then just plain text to sort of represent different voices speaking in this poem. And it's a very prose poem in its look. It's got more like a paragraph structure to it, which I think is really effective. I don't think you see this kind of complicated level of having multiple voices in a poem very often, but I think this is one of my favorite poems from the collection. I'm going to read one poem that I liked in particular that comes at the very end of the second section, so right about in the middle of this collection. It's called The First Day Without a Mother. In the hour of indigo, between sleeping and wake, a beloved teacher sits up on the funeral pyre. He smiles at me through flames that are dancing as they eat. I will see you again is one of the names for blue, a color beyond the human sky of mind. 1/3 up the ladder of blue is where we sit for grief. I was abandoned by lovers, by ideas that leaped ahead of time, and by a father looking for a vision he would never find. Do not leave me again, I want to cry as the blue fire takes my teacher. His ashes cool in my hands. I'm too proud to let go the tears. They are still in me. I keep looking back. Maybe I have turned to salt. It burns blue like the spirits who have already started to call me home, up over the last earthy hill broken through with starts of blue flowers that heal the wounded heart. Chickadee sings at dawn. I sit up in the dark, drenched in longing. I am carrying over 1,000 names for blue that I didn't have at dusk. How will I feed and care for all of them? So I really enjoy sort of the playing with blue in this poem. I think the final line is really poignant. It kind of leaves you reflecting for a second. I also think the structure of this poem is very interesting. So about the first half of the poem, we see these sort of line endings, right? And then that ends at this point, and then we kind of flip back and forth between these very short lines and these really long lines, which I think is interesting structurally, that within a single poem there's so much variety and movement. I think that's really reflective of the whole collection. I'm not going to read this one because it's pretty long, but I wanted to mention that towards the end, For a Girl Becoming is another one of my favorites from this collection. So it looks at sort of the birth of a child and all of the history that leads into that child being brought into the world and all of the people in the world anticipating her. And there's a lot of love and hope in this poem. I think it's a really important one to sort of bring in at the end of the collection. So yeah, I mean, I always say that reading is a great way to, you know, build your empathy and try and see the world from other people's perspectives. And I think this collection of poetry is a really beautiful, reflective view into the Native American experience on a personal and a larger level. And I always really enjoy musical verse in general, so that alone pulls me into this piece. So yeah, I would definitely recommend this. I look forward to exploring Joy Harjo a little more. I haven't read a lot of her poetry before, and I'd like to read her memoir too. Okay, so that's all I have for this video. Thanks for watching.